Everybody, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. The title of my channel comes from the title of a Star Trek Voyager episode entitled Tinker, Tenor, Doctor, Spy, which in turn got its name from a famous spy novel called Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy by John le Carré, which I have not read. Which brings me to my first point and the reason that I am here. I read, like everybody did, I read in school. I read a lot of stuff in school, the stuff that I was, the stuff I was required to read. Things like To Kill a Mockingbird, Lord of the Flies, Les Miserables, and A Separate Peace. In all actuality, I have to here now freely admit before all of you that a lot of times I don't really read these books, okay? So like, for instance, I remember To Kill a Mockingbird. I remember being fine with it, but I also don't really remember reading it. I remember the act of reading it, but I don't remember the book. I don't really know the story. I mean, that was my freshman year in high school. So it was a long time ago anyway, but I didn't really read it. I think I probably skimmed it and looked at every word on every page, but I didn't really read it. I kind of faked my way through my book reports and whatnot. Like, I didn't cheat exactly because there was really no way to cheat, because remember, this is back in the day. This is before the internet was everywhere. I don't know, it just somehow got by. And that's why I don't remember it, and so of course I have to read that book at some point. Les Mis I read all of, but we went to go see the show in high school, and so I was excited to see the show because it was musical. So I do remember liking that book. It was the abridged version by Wilbur. And I'm going to reread it, and I'm not going to read that version. I'm going to read a different version, I think. The only book I can remember reading in high school, and really reading and loving, to the point where I was walking around the house late at night in the dark, stumbling into things, reading it while I was walking because I couldn't stop moving. I just had to stay up and finish the book, and I think I finished it early, was A Separate Peace by John Knowles. Separate Peace is one of my favorite books, and I'm going to reread it soon, which I'm very excited about. But for some reason, you know, that book spoke to me and had something to say about male relationships, friendships. I went through phases where I read things like Star Trek books. Like I read parts of this book. I didn't finish it until recently, but like decades ago, started reading this book called The Lost Years, which is supposed to fill in the gaps between the end of the TV show and the first movie. But for the most part, I never really read anything. So what happened? I used to listen to this radio talk show called Coast to Coast AM. It's on late at night still. It has been for a very long time. It was hosted by a man named Art Bell, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And they, you know, it's a show where they would talk about Bigfoot and aliens and things like that. The show continues on with someone else, but he was interviewing an author one night named Tess Gerritsen, who, of course, is a very successful, well-known thriller writer, medical thriller, and mystery writer. She used to be a doctor from Maine, very much like Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote, except she's real. And she was being interviewed about a book called Gravity, which was about an extraterrestrial-based virus of some kind on the International Space Station. And she was really fascinating to listen to in this interview. I was living in New York at the time, and I actually decided, as I was wandering around in Columbus Circle, I went into Borders, which is obviously not there anymore. I did not find Gravity. What I did find was the first book that I read, really as an adult, of my own volition, a Rizzoli and Isles mystery, Vanish. But of course I didn't read the book because reading, what? Eventually though, what happened was I went on a tour of a show for many, many months, and I knew I was going to need books because I was going to need something to do while I was on the bus and while I was in my hotel rooms and whatnot. So I read this, I loved it. This is the story of a woman who is almost dead, but not quite. And she wakes up in the morgue. And I guess that's based on something that actually happened once. Sometimes people are not quite dead yet. It dealt with human trafficking, and of course it was a creepy mystery thriller, murder, bad person on the prowl situation, and I really enjoyed it. And then I eventually did get a copy of Gravity, and I read it. This was, Philip caught a fly, which was really, really good, and I gave a copy to my dad, and it's great. One of my favorite books of hers was called The Bone Garden. And part of it takes place in like Victorian England with a group of medical students learning to be doctors back in the day, which is very interesting. And I started realizing that I really enjoyed the parts that were historical, And if that's the case, there's lots of other books out there. And then I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And I didn't actually really enjoy this book very much. You're supposed to like this book, though, so I'm a bad person. My copy of The Road looks a little bit like it was in the story. I don't know how it got so dirty. At the time, I was just not there for all those. I don't know. What do you want to do? You have to say. We both have to say. Do you think we're... I can't. I was like, there's other books. This is how this kind of all started, this sort of reading renaissance, if you will. Every time Tess Gerritsen comes out with a new book, I read it. Tess Gerritsen had a new book. And so, of course, I was reading, as I do once a year. And I read the book, and then I decided that I wanted to, check out something else. There were a couple of her older books, her romantic thrillers that I had not read. And so I read this old book. I think it was her first published novel when she was still like a doctor, Under the Knife. Ooh, and that was about medical malpractice, which was really actually pretty fascinating. And there was like sordid history in there. And then I read Call After Midnight, which is like more of like a spy thriller romance. And then I read a book written by a friend of mine named Alethea Contis, who is awesome. She writes YA. She has a lot of stuff going at all times, but she wrote young adult thriller called Haven, Kansas, which hilariously to me, she wrote it not realizing that there was actually a town of Haven, Kansas. There is. So she dedicated it to them. But I loved that book, and she's awesome, and I will link to her below, to her author page. And then, I don't remember what I was seeing, but there was a trailer for Annihilation, starring Natalie Portman. And I thought, I really like Natalie Portman, and it looked crazy and cool, and so I realized it was an adaptation from a book that was pretty well thought of by Jeff Vandermeer, and so I decided this is a perfect opportunity. This is a perfect excuse to read something. It's relatively recent. It was published, I don't even know, and it's a trilogy, and it's like science fiction, and it's creepy, and it's like weird with a capital W, and so I read it. I think I read it in 2 or 3 days, and I loved it. And then I read the next two in the series, Authority, which was okay, and then I read Acceptance, which is the third in the trilogy, which was better again. And I was so fired up, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm reading so much. And then I started, doing all these Star Trek audio books. There was a series called The Genesis Wave, parts 1 and 2 and 3. The first part was terrible, but because they either came packaged together or they were cheap or something, I then listened to the second one. I listened to it on my drive back and forth to work every day. And the second one was a lot better, and I enjoyed the second one. Felt like the end, but no, there was a third. The third one has no reason to exist and is even worse than the first one. So don't. So I did those Star Trek. Oh, and then I read a really good tie-in novel to Star Trek Discovery called Desperate Hours, which tells the backstory of some of the main characters of the show. And all of the characters on that show are new to us Star Trek people. They're inventions for the new show. So getting their backstory in the book was cool. And Spock was in it, and he was written really well, I think. So I really enjoyed that book. I was surprised. And then I read The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, just because I'd been hearing about it my whole life. And I was like, it's free. I'm reading it. And classics. And so I did. And then I read this outrageously fantastic novel that I heard about on a podcast radio show that I'm probably going to make a whole nother video about. And the show is called Writers on Writing. It's been going for a long time, I think over 20 years. And they interview authors. And they interviewed this woman named Susan Henderson about this novel that she released very recently called The Flicker of Old Dreams. And this book is tough. This book is melancholy, but it's graceful and elegant and beautiful, and it's amazing. This book is amazing. I'm going to do a review on it. I mean, I don't know. I like a review. Like, who am I to be reviewing books? But I mean, in terms of how it affected me, I can do a review of how I felt about it. Wonderful book. And then I just was like off to the races. And then there was another Rizzoli and Isles book by Tess Gerritsen that I had been holding off on and saving. And then I read it. And then I read a lot of stuff. And I just was off to the races. And so that's what happened. And I'm having a lot of fun. When I'm reading, I feel I just like a little bit like sharper, just like mentally. I mean, who hasn't had the experience of being in a conversation and reaching for a word and it doesn't come and you can't think of what you were going to say. That got better. I realized when I was reading, I was in a better mood. I was sleeping better, and I actually had more dreams in a good way. Also, what I do for a living is that I'm an actor, and I'm a singer, and I write music, and I have a rough draft of a novella going, and as an artistic person, I want to expose myself to different points of view and different people's lives, and all of these are things that can happen through reading, and for all of those reasons, I decided I was going to make reading voraciously for the first time in my life in a way that I never had a priority. So I already had a Goodreads account for some reason, and I never used it. I don't remember why I signed up, but I wasn't using it. But I went to sign up and realized that I already had an account. All of a sudden, I just like went off the deep end. I put every book that I had ever read on my Goodreads, and I realized the list wasn't very long. It's very small. It's less than 100 books. 65 books in my entire life. And some of those 65 books were books that I had to read in school and books that I don't remember anything about and that I may have skimmed. And in 2018, I have read 24. If you think about how much I've read in my life, that's pretty extraordinary. I've read 89 books, you guys. And that's as of like today. Now I'm obsessed. I have like a TBR shelf and the want to read shelf. And so then now instead of just putting things in the want to read, it's in the want to read and the TBR. And then I take, it used to be called like things I own but haven't read, but then I renamed it TBR. And so now I've got want to read and TBR, and then I've got reading and things I need to read again and want to read again, and take it from want to read again or need to read again and put it into the TBR, and take it from the TBR and put it into the want to read in the TBR, and from the TBR into the reading and then the read. And so I got into all that, which is an addictive thing, and it's fun, and you all know. And then I started watching BookTube, which I realized BookTube is awesome because isn't it neat to watch videos on YouTube that aren't about technology or computers or TV, movies, Hollywood. Videos about something that I enjoy, that is fun, but that also is good for me. I'm hoping to use my Goodreads and now this account on YouTube, this BookTube, to motivate myself, to hold myself accountable to the goal that I have created on Goodreads, which is to read 52 books this year. Which is a modest goal. I think it's attainable. I started on February 1st. So it's a little bit more than one book a week, and I think that's good. I can handle that. I'm enjoying my reading. I'm mixing it up. I'm not staying with one genre. I'm like kind of crazy right now. I'm like going from one genre to the next. So all of that to say, that's who I am. Performer for a living, haven't read enough, on a journey of rediscovering the joy of reading. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to like it down below or subscribe to my channel. That would be very, very cool. I guess that's a thing that I say now. I will see you all in the next video. Keep reading, drink more coffee, and don't forget to eat.